To start out, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to who we are. Advantage Kentucky Alliance is the official representative of the Manufacturing Extension Partnership National Network in Kentucky. We are focused on helping small and medium-sized businesses thrive in today's technology-driven economy, and we help manufacturers become more globally competitive so that they can retain and even create additional industry and jobs within the state of Kentucky. So we offer expertise, training, facilitated planning to help identify areas of improvement, streamline processes, increase competitiveness, and create new revenue streams for businesses. Advantage Kentucky Alliance has received CARES Act funding to help alleviate impacts from COVID-19 to Kentucky manufacturers. This funding allows us to provide no-cost services to manufacturers around Kentucky, and these no-cost services include maintenance, operational, and supply chain assessments, as well as health and safety gap analysis and a COVID-19 reopening audit. And if you would like to learn more about some of these no-cost services, you can visit our website. It's advantageky.org. And we would love to answer any questions or go more in depth on each of those services. So today we have a two-part webinar. We have Brent Renfro. He will be discussing supply chain risk optimization, and then we have Jerry Duncan, who will discuss key performance indicators that drive performance toward company goals. And so both Brent and Jerry are senior continuous improvement specialists at Advantage Kentucky Alliance. Brent has more than 35 years of experience in manufacturing, specializing in operations management, supply chain management, quality systems, Six Sigma, and lean manufacturing. He has worked in a variety of industries, including heavy equipment fabrication, injection molding, tier 1 automotive supply, sheet metal fabrication and assembly, metal stamping and printing. And he is also certified in lean implementation, lean manufacturing. He's a lean manufacturing instructor. He has led lean implementation efforts at a variety of firms. And Brent is a graduate of Morehead State University and has completed lean systems training at the University of Kentucky. And then we have Jerry. He has over 40 years of experience in business and manufacturing. He has done everything from being a plant manager to owning his own business. He holds degrees in engineering and math and specializes in continuous improvement and lean in a manufacturing operations environment. Jerry also has expertise in lean office, especially as it regards expediting office processes from product design to accounts receivables. In addition, Jerry has been certified by NIST as a lean trainer and lean implementer, as well as a professional business advisor. So as we get going, please feel free to ask questions. You can also use the chat feature for any questions or comments that you might have. And then we will have time at the end of each part so that you can ask any additional questions. And I will go ahead and turn the time over to Brent to get us started today.
Okay. Thanks for coming into this, folks. Appreciate it very much. Want to welcome everybody and tell you a little bit about the supply chain risk optimization. Supply chain risk is actually a piece of the supply chain optimization program that we offer through AKA. And I'm going to be showing some slides as it relates to the optimization portion of it, and really tying those back to the risk piece. And that's something that we're doing through the CARES Act. So let me see if I can get my screen up here. Let's see. I'm not sure that anybody seeing this?
We did for a moment. I think you're on the right track.
Okay.
What we see is end of the slideshow. All right, there you go, Brent. We can see it now.
All right. Good
Thank you.
deal. Let me get back to the beginning of this. Okay, what I thought we would do today is talk a little bit about this as it relates to a business case, kind of a scenario for why should we be looking at risk assessment for supply chains. And one of the things to really establish a baseline is to determine what is a supply chain, and we'll look at some definitions here. Again, it's a network between the company and suppliers to produce and manufacture and distribute a product. So what you're looking at there as it relates to supply is the activities, the people, all the information and resources that are within that chain, taking the product from a supplier all the way up to getting the product on the dock of the customer. And again, those are managed and developed to try to reduce cost and remain as competitive as you can in the business landscape. Now, that definition you're seeing on screen came from Investopedia, and I thought that was as good as any. And let's talk a little bit about the importance of a supply chain. And again, it's key. If you think of product cost, for example, your product cost many times is it can be up to 70% of your product cost would be on your raw materials. So being able to manage that supply chain is really critical from a profit and loss standpoint, and be able to really manage the company's overall cost. If we have a breakdown within that chain, it can affect the whole supply chain and be costly. That really is an impact that you're seeing this year, specifically with the coronavirus, and but it's been present in the past, and I'll give you some examples and talk about that a bit as we move forward into this presentation. Some of the benefits there that you can expect from a good supply chain management is lower inventory, reduced transportation, warehousing, and packaging costs, have better flexibility within the supply chain. Hopefully you can give better customer service to your customers, as well as improve the revenues for your employer, and have better performance and profitability. So any questions at this point as it relates to what is a supply chain? If not, I will move forward. Now, a couple of things here. There was a study done that you'll see over in the upper right-hand corner of things that were deemed to be areas of need. And they broke those into critical and highly important. And the two things I want to point out is the mitigation of global risk under critical. And the fourth one, that was number 3. Number 4 is to reduce and manage the volatility in the supply chain. So again, those are critical aspects of what you're doing with your supply chain and how you manage that supply chain. This shows a roadmap of optimization of a supply chain, and it's broken down into strategy development, strategy implementation, partner engagement, partner deployment. On the left there, develop enhanced strategy, the red circle shows the identification of supply chain challenges, which is part of the risk assessment. And then the second one is the supply chain risk management plan. So the key there is to be able to identify the challenges and manage the risk, you have to identify those first. So that's part of this whole process. And I'm showing this to, again, build this business case moving forward. So supply chain risk management, let's talk about what that is and where we see that. We have a couple of perspectives there as it relates to supply chain, and it's really being aware of interruptions, and again, relating back to risk with the flow of goods, services, information, cash. And again, we're saying it should be a global perspective. So the value chain is a portion that is really facing the supplier, and the supply chain piece of it is pointing toward the customer. And both of those are kind of joined at the hip. And again, alignment of suppliers, identifying the suppliers, the logistics, the delivery and planning that takes this into the customer, as well as the production. We really have, most of the time, have a better feel for the production side of our business than we do the supply side. So again, giving a perspective as it relates to the supply chain / value chain. And again, they're almost one and the same, but they look a little differently. I want to give you a little bit on my exposure to risk management. Now, I've had issues in my, in my past as it relates to risk and supply chains. I've had issues with customers or suppliers going out of business. I've had containers thrown overboard and swept overboard in storms coming across both the Atlantic and Pacific. Many issues, but in 2014-15, I found myself working for a second time in my career for a tier 1 automotive supplier. And I got saddled with completing the Ford Motor Company audit for supplier risk, because I obviously had had some exposure to that in the past. So how that happened and why they did it was Ford Motor Company had a supplier in Thailand in 2011 that had issues, and they were causing late deliveries. And when they started looking into this, they found out that they really didn't know anything much past the tier 1s. And this was a tier 1, tier 2 scenario. And so they started, when that came to their attention, they started a whole program to look at their suppliers and do the due diligence and understanding the tier supplies and where the exposure was within that. So that was a yearly thing that Ford Motor Company did. I kind of, once I did a little research on it and understood the wherefores and the whys, it kind of, left a indelible thing with me. And I actually started doing some risk assessment using and I'll talk about this more when you see the spreadsheet, but using an FMEA, if you're familiar with failure mode and effects analysis, which is a manufacturing risk assessment. I was working at developing an FMEA to look at suppliers. So, and that's basically what the AKA program is developed by NIST, is looking at an FMEA base to look at our risk and quantify the risk and mitigate the risk as we see that with our suppliers. Couple of things there that talks about supply disruption as it relates to natural disasters. On the left, you see some Hondas at a factory in Thailand that were due to the flooding that happened as part of the tsunami that hit Japan. And on the right, the picture there is a shipping containers that are scattered about at a port in Japan. So again, those were together. And we talk about we don't really realize how fragile our supply chain is. Now, obviously, with this coronavirus, we have had a real bitter taste of that this year. But going back to 2011, you can look at they put a cost on what it cost for some of these countries, and Japan had $210 billion just for that tsunami. Thailand, New Zealand, US came out not too bad for a size of country that we have, but ours were tornado based. So again, most of our exposure up to this point has been with natural disasters, but obviously there's other things you have to look at. Now, again, to make our business case, we need to look at risk. In 2016, the Alliance Group put out a risk barometer, and I'll show this to you, and just don't try to add up the percentages because they're way more than 100%, but I'm not sure what that relates back to from a number standpoint. But business interruption as it relates to supply chain was number 1. Natural catastrophe, storms, floods, earthquakes 2. And notably, these cyber incidents, they were saying back at that point in time, were deemed to be a risk for business. And it was right behind the natural disasters. So, and you notice there really wasn't anything called out there as it relates to a pandemic. So with that, those are some of the things that are looked at when you go through and do the risk assessment and looking at risk exposure. Early this year, I started looking at, with the coronavirus, how this was going to roll out and affect people. And, you know, looking at 200 of the top 500 firms, and this came out of Deloitte, Canada, and Deloitte being a large accounting firm, had these 200 to 500 firms had a presence in the Wuhan province. If you remember the news at that point in time, that was where this outbreak really occurred. And some of the recommendations that they made was that you should focus, and down there I have it highlighted in red, focus on tier 1 supplier risk and illuminate the extended supply network. Again, make yourself aware of where that is and what some of those exposures are. Along with this, I would point out, we say 200 to 500, of the top Fortune 1000 companies, and Dun & Bradstreet put this out in February, 938 of 1,000 companies had one or more tier 2 suppliers impacted in the regions of China. And 90% of all companies globally with tier 1 suppliers in the impacted regions were headquartered in the US. So again, to make the business case toward looking at risk, we have the documentation there, and all fingers are pointing toward this. I wanted to put this in there as it relates to risk uncertainty. Again, these are more issues, and these are things that we look at when we do this risk assessment. You know, geopolitical risks, natural disasters, those are obvious. It does mention epidemics, terrorist attacks, environmental risk, volatile fuel prices, that big impact on trucking and transportation, both ocean freight and inland freight, labor costs, the currency fluctuations, all of these things, port delays, and all of these things were affected with the coronavirus. To give you a piece of information, in early April in England, they had 93% of their storage at their ports were used up, and which is typically, I mean, that's unheard of. They usually don't get anywhere close to that. And they knew at that point that they did not have, in 5 days, they were going to be at 100%, and they still had ships at sea. So, you know, what did this do? It caused us to have issues with freight, and people started cutting back on their routes. So, you know, there's not as much, lead time started to go up, certainly. So there was not as many choices for getting product to the market. Any question with some of these categories as it relates to risk? Okay, if not, I'm going to move forward. And I want to get into this because this is really the workbook portion of this is what we use for our risk assessment. And each of these build on the previous one. So I'm going to show you in just a minute what this looks like, but it's comprised of 8 different tabs on a spreadsheet. And the first one is your risk management plan and your categories, your ID of risk, your trigger statements, your impact analysis, your value and we start putting some dollar factors in there in number 7, and number 8 is really where we're looking at the mitigation and response, 7 and 8. So again, if you're familiar with an FMEA, you will see that this is a very close representation of what is done with an FMEA. So the workbook that you're looking at there is indeed a what we use, and this is done by Supplier. And if you notice that you've got your risk description, and this particular one is for a solar panels, and they talk about glass panel costs, and then we put in the if it happens, then what occurs. We put in our strategies there, a risk number, which comes from the number 5 tab at the bottom there, your risk impact analysis. It pulls that over and gives you a rating. In this particular case, anything above 200 is considered critical. The yellow is anything between 100 and 200, and below 100 is green. Now you can choose to address those as you see fit. Doing an FMEA, we typically put in a, I call it a threshold number. We would address things beyond a threshold. So we've got a threshold here in place. So, we put in, you may have multiple risk mitigation strategies. This particular one is looking at a long-term contract with the logistics suppliers. And we put in a trigger point. What's going to dictate movement? And as it's a 5% increase in fuel prices. And then as we go out into the orange area there, we put in our fallback strategies. And again, it's alternate sources. We identify a risk owner with their contact information. And we put some dates there when we're going to address these and what we're going to do to fix these situations. So again, it's a lot of information that's gathered. Some people have this readily, other people have to dig for it, but it does use the same thing that a FMEA does, which FMEA calls it an RPN number. This calls it a risk impact number. And it uses 3 categories to determine this: the severity of the risk, the occurrence, and the trigger. And on a FMEA, it would not be trigger, it would be detection, our ability to detect the issue. So this is what we use, and there's a lot of information, as you can well imagine, in these 8 sheets, and they all build. So it takes the information off of each one of these previous sheets, dumps it into the risk response and register, which is your final output. And this is where we have to go in and put our mitigation. So it's an Excel document. And again, this is what we build to give us the elements there of this risk management program. Very effective. It's a living document. This is not something that you do it once and it goes away. This is something that needs to be done and followed up on periodically. Any questions about this workbook? Okay. Some of the
Fred, I'm sorry. Is this only something that large manufacturers should be concerned about?
No, I mean, anyone, it's a good question. Anybody that has a supplier needs to be looking at the how well that supplier can perform. If I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a small company that is fabricating parts down in Southern Kentucky, and you're buying steel from a company up in the Louisville or Cincinnati area. And do you really know where their steel is coming from? Is it coming from China? Is it coming from a U.S. mill? How well are they managing those sources? Do they have alternate sources? So those are some of the things that we would ask. And regardless of the size of the company, this could be a 12 employee organization, you do need to be managing your supply side. So good question. Again, some of the things that we get out of this is if you do have insurance, and there, believe it or not, is insurance available for supply chain risk, you can drop your premiums. You should get a better relationship with your suppliers, hopefully avoiding some costs for you expediting freight. If you've ever had the emergency second source, which I've had to do that a couple of times, that's not fun. A lot of money involved, a lot of time, energy, and effort. Hopefully you can reduce inventories, improve your quality. Again, better lead times. You know, lead time's a factor. If you aren't buying in China and you're buying in, let's say, California, you've cut a significant part of your lead time off. And again, I'm talking about, you know, final sources there. And one of the issues I should point out at this stage is if you're buying from China, you don't know necessarily where they're getting product from, and it's really difficult when you see that. So, you know, the where product is coming from has a large impact on this. So really, that's what we're doing as it relates to risk management. I've tried to make a business case there for the why we do this. It's a matter of coming in and doing the due diligence and getting the information and forcing the people to rate suppliers and rate issues. And again, most people know this information. It's just a matter of putting it in a sheet and analyzing it. And then once you do that, then you've got to go back and do the remediation on the risk. Any
Brent,
other questions?
Yeah, Brent, do you find that the companies really understand their true cost of raw material?
Good question, Jerry. No, they don't. You know, it used to be the 3 quotes in a cloud of dust, and you know, if you, let's face it, from a purchasing person, one of the only things they can do is to make themselves look good is to reduce cost. And sometimes you're reducing cost and you're not knowing what that exposure is from a quality standpoint, a delivery standpoint. So yeah, people do not know what that impact is because they're not looking at that depth.
Oh, Brent, that brings me to another question. How difficult is it to go through the supply chain optimization process?
Well, the optimization process is a little more spread out there than the risk. The risk assessment is part of the optimization. Optimization is going into more of developing strategies and determining how we're going to manage things going forward with our supply chain and looking at it through a different lens. And again, traditional lenses, many times those are dictated by the accounting folks, and not to throw rocks at the accounting folks, but they dictate that many times. And it's got to be more in depth than that. You know, you got to be looking at quality, you got to be looking at delivery, you got to be looking at what the customers are doing, you know, with their technology. I read an article back in the spring talking about if we do start onshoring some of this work that is currently in China, what is that going to look like? I mean, what are we going to have in these plants in the future in the U.S.? And most people say there's going to be a lot of robotics, a lot more, you know, factory automation as it relates to being able to do automated setups and things such as that. And again, that technology has been around for a number of years. Why are we not doing it? Well, it's because it's a cash outlay. So that's the new norm, I think, out in the future with manufacturing. And certainly, I would love to see more onshoring because, you know, I've been exposed to doing this for a number of years, going back into the 90s and 80s. So it's, I think it's a very good thing. I highly recommend people go through this, whether you're large or small. And I think you'll learn some things about your supply chain that you did not know, and it will force you to address some of those issues. Any other questions? Well, that
I'll
concludes my
say,
portion.
Brent,
Yes.
one thing I see in small companies, they have absolutely no clout with suppliers. So if they do a lot of things up front, it solves a lot of problems. Seems like this is one of them.
Exactly. And, being careful with your selection of sources is mission critical. And too many times those things are organic and they grow out of a small operation, and they just continue forward. And you look back over a period of time and you say that we really probably didn't do the due diligence like we should have early on. But it's never too late to address these things. Okay.
All right. Any other further questions for Brent? And if you do have any, you can put them in the chat and we will get to those. We have Jerry Duncan with us. He was a little worried with the storm that was going through and his location that his connection might come and go. So we are going to play his PowerPoint, and he is with us to answer questions, but we wanted to make sure that we could get through it and not have any technical difficulties. So we will go to that.
Good day and welcome to Advantage Kentucky Alliance's webinar on selecting key performance indicators that drive performance toward company goals. I'm Jerry Duncan, Senior Project Manager, and will be presenting this session. Let's review the agenda. First, I want to talk a little bit about financials and how tying improvements to those financials are important. Then we're going to discuss goals versus KPIs, and we'll also talk about leading and lagging indicators. We'll discuss briefly some rules for developing KPIs, and then we're going to get into some typical KPIs for a manufacturing business. They apply to any business. Most of my examples relate to manufacturing. Sometimes there's some conflicting goals and KPIs, and they drive performance in a direction that we do not wish, or they're conflicting between departments. We'll summarize, and then we'll have a brief question and answer session. Financial statements are written records that show the financial health of our business. They're often audited by organizations that we may have loans with. They're also used for investing, and they are the basis for determining tax obligations. They are historical. Everything's already happened. There's no opportunity to change it. Basically, there's three financial statements. There's many. We'll look at these three. The balance sheet, and this shows us the assets of the company versus the liabilities that the company has, and also the stockholders' equity in the company, the book value of the company, not necessarily the true value of the company. The income statement, or more commonly called the profit loss statement, is a statement of revenues versus expenses. Are we making money? Could be positive, could be negative, a net profit. The cash flow statement measures how well that we're generating cash, how well we're collecting our money to pay our debts and obligations. Do we have enough cash on hand to meet the current need of the business? And so, can we stay in business? Now, just to review, financial statements are used by investors and creditors, other organizations, the government, and the financial statements were never developed to manage the business. So let's keep that in mind. They certainly are the final authority on how well we're doing. We need to tie any improvement that we make to the financial statement. So one of the first things I've always done is go to the controller and say, hey, this is the effort that we're attempting, and so how can we show this on the financial statements? Oftentimes I find that the information's already collected, it's just been rolled up. So if we would break it out in more detail, the information is there. And I've always found the controllers very willing and eager to work with you on identifying savings. So if we have improved productivity in the organization, that's going to lower our cost of goods, and so that'll show up on the income statement as a reduction in cost of goods sold, which trickles down toward profit. If we're collecting our money faster, that will show up on the balance sheet as more cash versus receivables, and also show up on our cash flow statement. Any kind of cost we reduce, say raw materials for example, will show up on our income statement. Sometimes we reduced our risk, and so for example we put a sprinkler system in our building that should lower our insurance premiums. Again, that'll show up on the income statement. Sometimes we have noise that will cover up our savings, and that's the reason we need to get this financial statements in more detail, so we could have accomplish our improvement in one department and something could happen. Either it's time for yearly raises, we have a reduction in selling price of our product on account of competition, maybe another department is not doing as well, and that will cover up the savings that we actually made. But if we have the detail there, then it will show our actual savings. So do work with the financial people to get understand your improvement efforts and where they'll show up on the financials. A goal is the desired final outcome. What are we attempting to accomplish? And so it's usually stated clearly, and it's also time bound. Now, KPIs, or key performance indicators, are measures that we use along the way to determine if our organization as a people are successful in accomplishing the targets that we set in the interim. So their performance is measured by these KPIs. This gives us good database decision-making capability. So let's look at two types. We have a leading KPI, and they're typically input-oriented, and they predict changes or how we're doing. So the reason for measuring these leading KPIs is that we do have time to take actions to make changes to improve the lagging KPI. So let's say, for example, we have a KPI of the number of contacts to new potential customers by week. So the respective lagging KPI may be the number of new customers that we actually achieve each month, and we'll have a target for that as well. So we can't change it after it's happened, but if we're making our weekly contacts to potential new customers, then at the end of the month, how many new customers did we actually obtain? So this lagging KPI for the month is actually a leading KPI for the year. So let's say in September we had a target of 5 new customers, and we actually had 8 new customers. So our lagging KPI tells us that we're on track to achieve the goal of increased sales. We have new customers. Now we know that what we measure gets done, and this is a statement by Peter Drucker, who is one of the leading people in lean manufacturing. But there's an old saying that says the same thing: if we take care of our pennies, the dollars will take care of themselves. So if we meet these KPIs, both leading and lagging, then it's highly likely that we will achieve the goal that we've set forward for the company. We should have a little understanding now of what the difference between a goal and a KPI is. Goals are often financial. KPIs are hardly ever financial. So we may have a goal to increase our sales in the Northeast by 6%. And if we drop down here, the number of calls to new potential customers in the Northeast would be one of our leading KPIs. So we may want to achieve a DSO, days sales outstanding, shorten the time that we actually collect our money, say, to 42 days. One of our leading KPIs may be the days to invoice. And so if that's an issue in your company, that might be one of the efforts, and I've certainly worked for companies that is an issue to get our invoice, the correct invoice to our customer. We want to reduce the cost of manufacturing by 2%. Certainly a KPI, and this should be an everyday KPI, is the labor hours that we have for a direct unit of production, and I'll define unit of production here later. If we're trying to reduce our landfill cost, and we have a target of so many tons, one of our efforts may be to reduce the number or increase the number of raw materials that we convert to reusable packaging. And so those would be leading KPIs. Let's talk about the KPI rules. This Jason Pyatt wrote an article in October of 2012, and some of the information on this slide I obtained from his article, and I've noted some other sources on other slides. I do encourage you to get on the internet. It's a wonderful source for information, and there's lots of information out there on KPI development. Let's remember rule number 1 is to focus on the critical few. What I've learned, both in consulting and also in management, is that when we introduce this concept of KPIs and it catches on and people understand how effective they are, they start wanting a KPI for everything. But my experience has been that if we have 3 or 4 for a group, that's about all that can be managed, and so that's enough. Make sure that the KPI is actually moving us in the direction that we want to go. So when we start measuring KPIs, are we getting the result that we intended to? So we need to revisit these to ensure that they are the proper KPI. They need to be understood by the group that's responsible. You know, in the financial world, overhead absorption percentages are common, but they're not very well understood by our direct labor and our first line and second line management. So instead of a metric like that, maybe a metric like unit ship per hour worked certainly would be more meaningful, and they would understand better how they influence that metric. Validate your KPIs. We have to be able to get the information and publish the KPIs timely. So if they're not available or they're not available timely, then it makes it very difficult for us to adjust our efforts. Ensure that they're controllable. Sometimes we give a group or a manager a KPI that they have little influence on or don't have total influence. And so they need to have the authority, if they're given a KPI, to make the changes and efforts necessary to obtain that KPI. I'm sure many on this webinar have seen the SMART acronym before, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of points and we'll move on. But certainly make your KPI specific. We talked about them being measurable. They also have to be achievable. And so if we're shipping, let's say, 85% on time, and they say, well, we should be at 100%. Well, that doesn't make sense. There's some reason we're at 85%, and maybe a KPI of 90% in 3 months is more realistic, so we would work up for that. We have a KPI of 87%, 88%, 90% over the next 3 months, and then we would develop several leading KPIs. So we would look at when they're being shipped. Are they being shipped by UPS or freight? Are they being shipped on the second shift, first shift? Is the orders late to shipping? We would have several other KPIs that related to that, and we'd look at that. So they certainly have to be achievable and realistic, and always set a time frame. We've already addressed that to some extent, but we have to set targets, and these KPIs move us toward those targets. Some typical KPIs. I do want to spend a little time on this one because this is a very important concept in this: units per direct labor hour. And so how do we establish a unit? We may select a product that we make often, and people understand about how much effort is in that product, and then we're going to equate that to, say, 1 unit. And then we're going to equate all the other products that we make based on this unit value. We're going to give each one of those a unit value, and then we're going to track direct labor. If we're more machine oriented, it might be machine uptime to units produced. But anyhow, we're going to track this, and the reason I feel like this is a very important measure is that it is meaningful over time. So if the product price changes, then that has no impact on the unit. Now I realize that we're going to do automation. We may find better ways to make it, and that's going to change the labor effort or the machine effort in it, and that's something that we may need to adjust over time. But hardly ever do we adjust that. We just recognize those as improvements. Now, overall equipment efficiency, overall operating efficiencies are good measures, and they have several measures within them. If we're highly dependent on equipment, then overall equipment efficiency is a great measure, and you can look that up in the more detail. There are several components to it. I haven't listed all of them here, but unscheduled downtime, that's a good measure in any company that has lots of equipment. If you're doing lots of changeover, machine changeover time is a good measure. Of course, we want to reduce all those. There's lots of KPIs, and of course you can develop your own, but you should look at ones that are, applicable to your business. And the ones I'm talking about are pretty typical. So inventory turns, anytime we can increase inventory turns, we increase the value of our inventory by making it more fresh. Also, we reduce the amount of money that we have to invest in inventory if we're turning it more quickly. If this is an effort, then we also probably would want to have another KPI of inventory accuracy. If our inventory is accurate and we're maintaining the correct inventory, then we can increase our inventory turns. Quality, this is just a no-brainer. We need to measure quality in some fashion. Most companies measure first pass yield, and this is usually a percentage. Now, what I've also found is that we'll measure first pass yield, and then that's our measure. But we also need to look at some other KPIs related to that. Rework. Rework is a huge cost, and it's a total waste. If we can do it right the first time, then we eliminate this unnecessary cost. Usually 2 measures: the amount of labor and how much material cost do we have in it. If we assign these values, then it really emphasizes the value of making everything right the first time. Let's talk about people related. And most, especially small companies I go to, really don't do a good job of doing this. Attendance should be a people metric. That's certainly a leading indicator of a lot of things. If we don't have our people there, our production can't run fully efficient. Sometimes our knowledge drops considerably if one of our key people is out. So attendance is a real good measure, and this should be measured at the lowest level in the company, and then rolled up to one figure. But if the people in the groups, departments, whatever, we can see peer pressure from there to increase attendance. The supervisor is the first, or the leader is the first contact with that person, and they can help them resolve issues to better their attendance. And employee turnover, this is a lagging, and if we have attendance problems, I can guarantee you that our turnover problem is big too. But still a key measure. And I again say that this metric should be posted at every department level. Safety is often a separate metric. I've just grouped it here for convenience under people. But safe, healthy workplaces encourage attendance, encourage good performance, and no one's in business, I don't think, to hurt people. And so, an unsafe workplace does increase turnover and certainly increases our cost, both in compensation rates and in injury. So revenue per employee, you see some others. On-time delivery. This is a key metric. Everyone understands the importance of getting our product to our customers on time. That's a reassuring thing. If we're shipping product on time, then our customers like us and they're going to stay with us, and our business is going to be better. And that's reassuring to employees. And this is also a good metric to reward employees on if you have some kind of a merit system. Sometimes we have conflicting goals. And so let's say we want to reduce raw material costs by 2%, and then we want to increase inventory turns. Oftentimes buyers can buy larger quantities and reduce costs rather quickly. However, turns would go down. So these could be, if we're given a metric to reduce raw material cost, the same person should be assigned the responsibility for increasing inventory turns. Reduce overtime costs by 10% for the year. And then we want to ship orders within 5 days of receipt. And we want to increase inventory turns. Clearly these metrics would not be owned by the same group, but if we increase inventory turns, we perhaps could decrease our ability to supply orders on time, so that needs to be considered. If we had the opportunity to work overtime to meet a customer ship date, and now we have a focus to reduce overtime, those have to be balanced as well. And so here's another one. We want to eliminate our customer invoice discounts, but at the same time, we want to reduce our days of sales outstanding by 5 days. Fortunately, likely this would be owned by the same manager. So we have to be careful that we implement both complementary KPIs and KPIs that do get us in the direction we want to go. So productivity and quality and people are always three metrics that we want to measure and make sure that they're aligned with our goal. So in summary, we have financials, and they're almost always the final judge of success and failure. So in long term, if it doesn't show up on the financials, it never happened. Now there can be things that we do that better our company. If we reduce our turnover, we're going to reduce our costs, we're going to reduce acquisition cost of new people, and it will show up on the financials. It's harder to capture and harder to define, but it will be there. So goodwill, if we're shipping to our customers on time, certainly our sales go up. We have things that will indirectly be impacted by shipping on time. They're a little hard to measure. Make sure that the KPIs are understood by the people and they have the opportunity to influence that metric. Leading KPIs give us time to address the shortfalls of performance and make changes to achieve our targets toward our end goals. A group of KPIs will focus efforts to achieve the goals that are important to the company. Like I mentioned before, complementary KPIs. Achievement of the KPIs really do demonstrate the effectiveness of the management and the people's performance. Again, take care of the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves. Okay, I'm going to open up for questions now.
Hi, Jerry. I have a question. You mentioned measuring labor hours against a unit of production. Can you give us some more insight on how that unit of production is determined?
Okay, what we want to do is identify, a product or a number of products that represent a certain amount of effort. And it depends on, our volume of production, what that might be. But I know in lots of small companies, they'll pick out a unit that's, say, 2 hours of effort, and then they will assign the other products that they make to that and give it a respective unit value. And then you can measure the hours of labor against the number of units that you produce, which is also a way of loading your plan as well. So, good question. Thank you.
Hey, Jerry, this is Brent. A quick question as it relates to these competing KPIs where you mentioned, purchasing may buy ahead versus, a target out there to reduce inventory. How often do you see those, and what are some of the ways that you can mitigate that?
Most time I think I experience that between groups in the company, like purchasing and shipping and manufacturing. Our management has set targets for each of those groups, and in reality, they will conflict with each other in some degree. And so that's where we really need to spend quite a bit of care when we assign these. And often people are given bonuses based on their performance. So that makes it even more critical. So purchasing often always has some KPIs, and they can interrupt production if we get our inventory too low and we run out of something, and that interferes with a KPI in production. So those are the kinds of things I see. I'm sure you've seen them as well, Brent. You have some good experience there too.
Sure. One notable thing I saw once upon a time was a plant manager, his number one KPI was the amount of dollar product shipped out the door on a daily or weekly basis. But in reality, he had very little to do with the sales portion of that and the orders coming in. His metric was not really as relates to the manufacturing of the product. It was about shipping it out the door and how much shipped. So that's a good example of a bad.
And that's where we talk about, that's where we talk about that the person assigned the metric has to have control,
Right.
Has to have the authority to make decisions, right?
Good presentation.
All right, thank you. We are on right out of time, so that was perfect timing. Thank you for joining us. We have a webinar next Thursday. I'd like to invite you to register for it. It's on expert documentation.